Hey everybody, welcome to the Systems of Human Performance podcast. This is episode number 5, and today we're going to be talking about technology and kind of the ideology that I have regarding responsible technology. This is a bit of a departure from what I've talked about in the past. Usually I'm talking kind of in depth about systems design and improvement and kind of the components therein. And I wanted to just depart from that a little bit to talk more broadly about the role of technology, how I view it, and kind of the principles that I think make for good technological use and development. So before we dive into this article, I'd ask you to go ahead, ring the bell, like, subscribe, do whatever you can to help me perform well in the algorithm. Of course, that's very important to podcasts being found. So with that out of the way, we'll go ahead and dive into it. I've gone through and I've kind of marked up this article. I'm going to go back in and remove these boldings, but they'll at least help me jump around this article and give you the stuff that's most important in terms of the material, the body of the article. So the first thing I wanted to do in the article is introduce kind of our own conception of technology. And I take the historical perspective, and the historical perspective has been that technology is synonymous with progress, especially if you go back into the 17th, 18th, 19th century. Technology was very highly correlated with the well-being of societies, with how societies were progressing. Of course, we have the agricultural revolution, we have the industrial revolution, and now we kind of have the post-industrial revolution, where obviously we're being pulled out of kind of this subsistent form of living into this new modern age that we have today. And of course, this has perpetuated that idea of, yes, look, if you look at technology, we get better, society gets better as technology improves. As technology develops, so also does our society. But it seems to me that towards the middle to end of the 20th century and into the 21st century, technology is now sort of decoupled from that societal progress. And in fact, it seems now that it might actually be countering what we would define as a good society. And if you just think of kind of some of our biggest issues regarding like social media and smartphones, there's seems to be a lot of overabundance, overconsumption, and all of this is kind of bound up now in what our technology or our current state of technology is. And this is right off the bat, one of the things we need to just come into this wide-eyed and with eyes wide open, right, is that technology has long been considered that harbinger of progress, but no longer, and it's quite empirical that that's the case. I go on in this paragraph to talk about this kind of pithy phrase, the saying we were promised hoverboards and instead got 141 characters directs us to the reality of technology. We need not look any further than our own daily experiences to see the hollow, superfluous applications and uses of our smartphones. Is this the progress promised by technology? Perhaps the allure of technology and its danger is best summarized by MIT professor and AI pioneer Joseph Weizenbaum. He has this great book, by the way, called Computer Power and Human Reason, which I highly recommend. He was a founding AI pioneer of the first AI model called ELIZA. And this is what he has to say in his own book, published way back in 1976. He says, science, and we can truncate that to mean technology, promises man power. But as so often happens when people are seduced by promises of power, the price exacted in advance and all along the path, and the price actually paid, is servitude and impotence. Power is nothing if it is not the power to choose. And this is quite a theme that you're going to see in this article, but also in his book, is technology is great, but if we don't take it for what it is, if we don't understand truly what it is, it can lead to some dubious unintended consequences. And of course, hell is paved by good intentions, but by dubious consequences. So this is kind of the point of it, right? If we look to the future with optimism, it should be only because of the increase of human flourishing. I shouldn't look to the future and say, wow, the future is going to be so technologically brilliant. It's going to make today look so trivial and so quaint because of the new technologies. I shouldn't care, right? What I should really care about in the future is whether or not we are closer to a good society. And if we are closer, if humans are flourishing, if we do have more joy and more leisure and more meaning in our lives, that's a good thing, whether or not technology helps or not. But if I'm just looking at technology as an alias for progress, that's going to muddle the water. And I think I might arrive at point A, which is human flourishing, but that's not where my compass is set for. And that's the issue. Human flourishing will be achieved not because of technological progress, but it seems to me, based on the 20th and 21st century, despite technology. To ensure the thriving of individuals, communities, and societies, rules and principles ought to exist to govern and limit the development, design, implementation, and use of technology. And there we are, 6 minutes into the podcast. That's what this article is really about, is how can we understand technology and then create rules and principles to govern it and govern the way we use it and develop it. Okay, the first thing we want to talk about, I talk about this often in many of my articles. I just did a whole article specifically on the automation paradox, but we need to talk about automation. In my thinking, every technology is essentially automation, right? From a steam engine to a computer program to AI, right? Essentially all these things that they're doing is they are taking the human out of it and they are letting a machine do it, oftentimes more productively, not always, but is usually the case. That is kind of the whole mechanism of technology, is automation. Now, the issue we have with this is that there exists something called a paradox of automation. Don Norman is an industrial designer. He's quite famous for working with Apple and a group called IDEO. He has a famous book called The Design of Everyday Things, and he explains this paradox of automation in that book. He says, when the automation works, the tasks are usually done as well as or better than by people. Moreover, it saves people from the dull, dreary routine tasks, allowing more useful, productive use of time, reducing fatigue and error. But when the task gets too complex, automation tends to give up. This is, of course, precisely when it is needed most. So one example of this, of paradox of automation in action, is the Boeing 737 MAX tragedies. And we know that the 737 MAX was poorly designed. It had many known design flaws. And rather using the technology that we have available to us to design a more aerodynamic airplane, the Boeing engineers actually decided to put it into place, but have this overriding, what they called the MCAS system, an overriding algorithm to adjust for the plane's poor aerodynamics. And essentially the plane's nose would tend to elevate. So the software, the MCAS, would simply push the plane's nose down. And if you've ever seen kind of the terrifying videos of what this was like for the pilots who crashed, the MCAS system kept engaging and then disengaging. And every time it was engaging, it was pushing the nose down when it ought not to have. So it was just going into this terrifying nosedive that the pilots didn't know how to control. Now, this is concerning, particularly regarding the paradox of automation, because what they were hoping to do was create an overriding technology and there wouldn't be any issues. And because it was automated, the people, the pilots in particular, were not used to using this technology, used to turning it off, knowing how to disengage it. There's actually several controls to disengage this thing. But because it was part of automation, the pilots were not routinely used to engaging with the automation itself, and particularly when the automation turned off, which is, as Don Norman says, when we need it the most. That's when the pilots actually had no time to think through the issues or react to what was going on. And that's kind of the paradox of automation played out, right? Is that when we need it most, it fails us. And because it fails us right then, that's actually when we don't have a lot of the training and expertise and experience needed to figure out what to do in that situation. Now, this other guy, Ralph Nader, he wrote a famous book called Unsafe at Any Speed. I believe episode 2 or 3 of this podcast talks specifically about that book, or at least a chapter of it. And he also talks about this thing called the arrogance of the algorithm. It's very similar to what we see with the MCAS and the 737, which is essentially, instead of using all of our technology and all of our skills and expertise to design something better and safer and more reliable and resilient, we instead kind of have this hubris of designing things poorly, but then expecting to put an algorithm in place of it, thinking that that's going to solve the problem. Now, kind of sickly and kind of a sad twist of fate, one of his relatives, I think it was his niece, his grandniece, was actually killed in one of these 737 MAX airline flights. But he actually was talking about this arrogance in the algorithm all the way back in 2016 with regards to driverless cars. And he says too many complex variables cannot be anticipated with driverless cars, especially when the vast majority of cars on the road are traditional driver-directed cars, who behave in a whole variety of ways that aren't predictable, not to mention bicycles and puddles and potholes and shiny sides of trucks. That's why I call it the arrogance of the algorithm. So what he's saying is a very basic truth of technology. I had also done an article not that long ago on what I called the Rasmussen paradox, which says technology performs very, very well when it is within its optimally designed domain. As different variables and complexities come into the environment, the technology becomes worse and worse, and manual intervention is needed and oftentimes performs better than that technology. And that's essentially what Nader is talking about here, which is in the realm of driverless vehicles or just vehicles in general. There are so many different variables that cannot be accounted for. We cannot build, and we shouldn't think that we can build some algorithms, some guiding force that is going to perform as well or better or safer than manual operators behind the wheel. And to think that is what he calls the arrogance of the algorithm. The dream of technology as the ultimate means of control, safety, and human flourishing remains and will remain unfulfilled. That's the basic idea of the arrogance of the algorithm. If anything, our technological history should clearly direct us to curb our enthusiasm for technological advances. Moreover, it should temper our beliefs regarding the limits of technology and its uses. The paradox of automation should compel us to seek rational principles and rules for the creation and use of technology and not pursue advancement and progress with reckless abandon. So just kind of ending that section, talking about our current paradigm of seeing technology as progress, and then seeing some of the ways that these mechanisms of technology can lead us astray because we don't often recognize them what they are. I haven't written it in this article here, but there's this other great idea that I'll just add to the podcast, which is counterfactuals of technology. Is every time we create a technology, we also create the positive use of that technology, and we create the negative use of the technology. So as an example, there were no shipwrecks before we created ships. When we created ships, we were able to sail the oceans, sail the seas, do trade, conduct war, have navies, have mercantile systems, but we also lost many, many souls to the sea. And that's true of all technology, is not only when we design technology do we design the positive cases, but we also design all the catastrophes. When we design the locomotive, we also design the train derailment. When we design the plane, we also design the plane crash. This cannot be decoupled from technology. It is part and parcel with technology, and we just have to accept it that when we create technology for a particular purpose, we also create that technology that has the counterfactual outcome to it. So now we're going to kind of go back to Weizenbaum's thought on technology, which is talking a little bit about how he thinks of it in terms of legacy, right? And in particular, what he's going to talk about, or what we're going to talk about in this article, is that when we select a technology and we put it into place, it leaves a legacy and it binds us and it constrains us to what we can do in the future. To consider technology responsibly, we must go beyond the risks of bad-natured and negligent use of technology. Technology also creates and influences numerous dynamics that affect individuals, communities, and societies. One of the most important of these dynamics is the issues of technological legacy, maintenance, which will befall future generations. So we have the maintenance component of it, but we also will talk about what it can limit us to. This consideration is best expressed by the question, how far should future generations have to work to circumvent the technologies we've invented today? Humans evolve, needs change, priorities shift, societal norms and taboos alter. When we create and use technology, whether at a personal or commercial level, we are not just implementing a neutral device. We are integrating our ideas, priorities, and values into the world, or at the very least, making decisions about the use of technology based off those same attributes. Through technology, we create a world that reflects our values. To act responsibly, we must have an appreciation for this reality with an eye for the future, not merely trying to predict what they will want or need, but rather allowing future generations the flexibility to choose for themselves based on their values and priorities, unencumbered by the technological legacy of yesteryear. So there you have it. You can kind of think about all the technologies you wish your grandparents would have let you select. Are you happy with a combustion engine in your vehicle? Would you have liked previous generations to have invested more in electric engines, or perhaps more in high-speed rail, or more in dirigibles and not airplanes? We have lost the ability to choose those things for ourselves. We are stuck with the legacy of previous generations' choices, and that will be true for future generations based on our choices. And therefore, we need to, again, have eyes wide open to these realities. Is as we're going and venturing into the cusp of artificial intelligence, what will that mean for the future world? Will they be able to turn it off? To what degree will they be able to alter our choices now in terms of algorithms and in terms of how choice is mediated in their societies of the future? To finish up that section, I'll just read the last paragraph. If a future society seeks to undo some of these procedures, technology, to what extent will our own technology, riddled with our own values, impede this transition? Right? Do we love to have free will? We love to have free choice. Will we offer that to our grandchildren? Will our children be able to free themselves from an internet experience mediated by malign algorithms? Will they be able to disentangle a large centralized federal government if they deem it worth doing? Through the way we've implemented technology, have we already made the decisions for them and stripped them of their autonomy and right to self-determination? Now, that brings us to this next section, which is really, we need to have an end for technology. We mentioned that we've kind of been pursuing, historically, technology as human progress. And we've kind of said that technology is oftentimes highly correlated with human progress, with society. And that's a good thing, but recently it seems like it's lost its way. So how do we get it back? Is we no longer focus on technology qua technology, but we have to focus on something and try to pursue that, try to direct technology in that direction. And the word that I have for that is conviviality. And this comes from a guy named Ivan Illich, who's a great kind of dissident thinker. And he wrote a whole book called Tools of Conviviality. And it's quite about this idea of having aims and directions of technology rather than just pursuing technology and innovation for its own sake. I write, the gold standard for technological innovation should be conviviality, the harmonious coexistence of individuals and communities with technology. This idea was first presented by Ivan Illich in his 1973 book, Tools for Conviviality. Convivial tools, and by that he means technology, are those which give each person who uses them the greatest opportunity to enrich the environment with the fruits of his or her vision. And I apologize for all these books being 50 years old. I think it's actually kind of refreshing that a lot of these thinkers have been thinking about technology for so long, for generations, right? That is right when computers were we kind of understood what the future was going to be with computers. And I think a lot of the principles that are being discussed by just prolific minds such as Weizenbaum and Illich and Rasmussen from his Rasmussen paradox and Don Norman, I think are quite apt to the technological challenges and decisions that we face today. This remains the chief aim of technological pursuits for several reasons. Here I'm talking about conviviality. First, the conception of what technology should do is open to a variety of technologies, modes of operating, procedures, standards, and various applications. So it's not constrained, right? Is the idea of conviviality can live in the future, it can live in the past, and it can apply to many different technologies. Secondly, the ethos of conviviality is not loaded with any priorities, use cases, taboos, or values. So again, it's very open. It allows us to choose it now. It allows future generations to choose it later. It is merely an expression that technology should aim to benefit human beings and should do so in a harmonious way. Third, it recognizes natural scales and limits of technology that we've thus far uncovered. Only within limits can machines take the place of slaves, Illich declares. Without limits, we become slaves to technology in various forms of overconsumption, irresponsibility, and indulgence. And that is exactly what we've seen in the 20th and 21st century. And I've given you kind of a couple of the mechanisms of how this has worked, right? In particular, the paradox of automation, the Rasmussen paradox. We could talk about things like planned obsolescence, which is, a technological procedure that has certainly led to overconsumption and indulgence. So what we need to do with Illich's idea in mind is to have limits which we can apply to technology and to machines and to our own interactions with these machines that govern how we should interact with them, but also how we should seek to develop future and new technologies. So I have 5 rules in this article that I'll go through that I think are good rules for pursuing technology and development. Rule number 1 is productivity over counterproductivity. Very intuitive rule. One of the greatest assets of technology is its ability to make us more productive. Indeed, the benefit of productivity is one that is appealed to most, right? When people think about technology, they always say, well, it makes us more productive. We need to stay innovative because we'll be more productive. But as this author, Michael Simmons, has shown, over the last 50 years, productivity, which is measured as GDP per hour worked, despite technological advances, has actually decreased. So we're more technologically advanced than we were 50 years ago. There's no dispute about that. But yet somehow, despite all this technology, we're actually producing less in terms of hour worked. How come? And the productivity didn't decrease despite innovations, it decreased because of them. In the last 50 years, technologies have focused less on productivity and more on the things that are good for business. Planned obsolescence, there it is. Model year design alterations, subscriptions, and superfluous add-ons are good for business, but not for conviviality. Any technology that cannot demonstrably improve productivity should not be pursued. So there you have it. We can think about all the little bells and whistles. We're on iPhone 17, I think now. We're creating new model year alterations of every vehicle on the road. Next year, there will be a new version of that vehicle, and that takes engineering, and that takes design, and it takes testing, and it takes the procurement of parts and the changeover of factories. And is it really doing anything for our productivity, right? Is it really technological advance if it's not advancing our own productivity? Rule number 2, decentralization over centralization. Technology should empower individuals and communities rather than centralizing power in the hands of a few. Centralization breeds alienation, obstructs transparency, and creates complexity. The Cambridge Analytica scandal is a well-known case study and cautionary tale about the importance of data security and privacy. But it never would have happened without Facebook's most important feature, the centralization of online interaction. By creating a single platform for all people to interact, connect, and advertise, Facebook gained access to personal information of more than 1 billion users. This created an opportunity for a massive data breach. The automation paradox is alive and well. But this scandal also exposed the way that technology can obfuscate transparency and be used to alienate and exploit users of the site. In this particular example, the data breach demonstrated the predatory and biased practices of news sites and advertisers that was able to be achieved through a centralized system. Decentralization foils many of these bad practices and drastically mitigates the risks. In fact, many movements, such as the open source movement and the indie web, are making great strides in decoupling user experiences from centralized corporate websites. Technological decisions that consolidate rather than distribute authority and knowledge should be avoided. And again, I give the example of the Cambridge Analytica scandal. We can also just take the concept that Weizenbaum was talking about legacy and having things kind of hard-coded for the future. If we centralize things, that is much more rigid, it is much more ossified and less likely to break up. Versus if we have something that's more distributed, that is far more likely, it's more fragile, it's more adaptable, and it can change and evolve, and so on and so forth. So that's why we would, as a rule, we should prefer decentralized technology, in particular things like open source technology, over centralization. Rule number 3, a personal hobby horse of mine, design for humans. If you are subscribing to Systems of Human Performance, this is an ongoing theme. If you're not subscribing to Systems of Human Performance, please do. I try my best to bring in the human element to all things system design. The prime movers of technology are humans. In every technological endeavor, there is at some level an interaction with a human being. This interaction should be one of the primary focuses of the design, use, and implementation of a technology. The strengths and limitations of human actions and decision-making are well known. In the design of human-machine interactions, the human strength should be exploited and the weaknesses supported. In particular, technology should be pursued if it incorporates good human-centered design principles like preferring simplicity to complexity, embracing transparency, exploiting natural connections, recognizing the power of constraints, and anticipating human errors. So a lot of these concepts are things that we talk about on this podcast as well as on the Substack. So I won't go into them in detail, but certainly as we have an eye towards technology, we should be thinking about how we integrate the human into that technology rather than how we subvert the human and remove the human from the process. Rule number 4 of 5, self-limitation. Technology should be used to create new ways of self-limitation. This means not only that new technology should be developed to stop current issues of overconsumption and proliferation of harmful technologies, but that all future technologies should be deployed with mechanisms for bounded and responsible use. Lewis Mumford, who's another favorite philosopher and historian of technology of mine, he expresses it this way: a sound and viable technology firmly related to human needs cannot be one that has a maximum productivity as its supreme goal. I've recently seen kind of this meme going around that says growth for growth's sake is the philosophy of a cancer cell. And I agree with that. He continues, it must rather seek, as in an organic system, to provide the right quantity of the right quality at the right time and at the right place in the right order for the right purpose. To this end, regulation and direction, in order to ensure continued growth and creativity of the human personalities and groups concerned, must govern our plans in the future as indefinite expression and multiplication have done during the last few centuries. Oh my goodness, that's a mouthful. But what essentially he's saying is, like organic systems, like animals and flora and fauna and all these environments, is it's not just enough to produce more, but it also has to be producing the right thing at the right quality in the right place at the right time for the right purpose. It's the system. He's really saying it's the systems aspect of it, is it all has to work in concert. I don't want to locally optimize just the growth of something in our society, call it technology, but we rather need to treat society as a whole, understanding that technology has a role to play in it, but that society is not ordered to serve technology, but rather technology is subordinated to serve society. And rule number 5, prevent irreversible changes. This is kind of the Weizenbaum idea. Technology cannot be implemented in such a way as to prevent its undoing. Future generations ought to have free will and be unencumbered by our generation's decision about technology. Again, Weizenbaum expresses the threat of not following this principle best. He says technology, he probably says science, but I'm going to use the word technology here, becomes an indispensable component of any structure once it is so thoroughly integrated with the structure, so enmeshed in various vital substructures that it can no longer be factored out without fatally impairing the whole structure. So there he's saying, if you take something like the automobile, we can no longer have a society without the automobile. Everything that we have designed in terms of city infrastructure centers around the automobile. Though there are other it's not inevitable to all technologies. We do quite well without landline telephones. We could probably do quite well without regular telephones because we have alternative methods for communication. We don't use fax machines or teletypes or typewriters. These things are not part and parcel of our society. So we need to have that in mind as we design future technologies, as we engage in new technologies like AI. Technology is not an unmitigated good, is kind of the final thought of this article here, which is technology should not be pursued for its own sake. There are many principles that we need to put in place to self-limit and self-regulate how we use technology and how we interact with it in kind of our human-machine interactions. Most importantly, I think if you don't take my 5 rules of useful and responsible technology as canon, I would certainly hope that you at least think about kind of the things that we've talked about here that are strongly correlated with technology. We cannot get away from them. The paradox of automation, the Rasmussen conundrum, the counterfactual nature of technology. There are things that technology that is not intended, and that oftentimes the biggest promoters of technology, the biggest billionaires or people who are so bullish on startups and AI and all these sorts of things don't want you to understand. Perhaps they don't understand it themselves. But that's not an excuse for us not to understand it and to advocate for useful and mindful and sober use of technology. So there you have it. That is this article, my most recent one, which is titled Responsible Tech. It's on the Substack right now. It's free for all. It will always be free for all. If you like this podcast, please let me know. This is, like I said, a slight deviation from what I normally do, which is kind of going deep into systems thinking theory. But if you like this, you'd like to see more of it, please let me know. Write me a comment, send me a DM. As always, I would ask you to please like and subscribe and follow and do all of those things that can help me out in the algorithms. With that, I will wish you a Merry Christmas. Here it is 12/18. I know Hanukkah is going on right now as well, so if you are Jewish or celebrate Hanukkah, happy Hanukkah, and I will see you all in the new year.